Hello everyone. Welcome to our last art history class of the school year. Next week we're going to move into our summer program, and so then we'll get started on some really crazy big projects, which will be awesome. Let's go ahead and get started with our prayer. So go ahead and fold your hands. All right. Dear Jesus, thank you for allowing us to learn together. Thank you for the ability to create and make things that remind us of you. Amen. All right, friends. So we're going to go over all of the stuff that we learned this semester, which was a lot of stuff, right? I have it all over this table in front of me. It was a ton of stuff. So the first week that we started meeting and I started coming into your classrooms to talk to you about art, we read this book called Beautiful Oops. I don't know if you remember this, but the big takeaway from this book was that sometimes mistakes, like a spill, can be turned into something else. Puppies, an elephant, there's lots of options for turning a mistake into something else. And that was one of the things I really wanted to talk to you about when we first started doing art, because I didn't want you to feel like I can't do it exactly the way you're doing it and I'm upset about it. I wanted you to feel like it's okay if we do something different and we just work on it, right? We just work on it and change it, and that's great. After this first week, when we did that, we started talking about famous artists. And we started with someone named Claude Monet. And we went through a couple of his pieces of art, right? I don't know. Think for a second. Do you remember these pictures that we talked about? That one's called The Magpie. Oh, this was quite some time ago that we talked about these. That one's called Sunrise, and this was the favorite one, Train in the Snow. We also read a book called A Picnic with Monet, and so we talked about all of these famous works of art that he had completed, and then we picked one, this one if you'll remember, and we made artwork. So do you remember I brought you a canvas and it had a bridge taped on the front of it? And you told me, Miss Bridget, this looks like train tracks, because it kind of did. And then we painted over that, and we painted like this with our fingers and paint, and we were kind of playing the piano or making it rain. And that's what we were doing on our canvas. And then after all of that, when they dried, we ripped the tape off and the bridge was left. That was very cool. And we called that, where the bridge was, we called it negative space. All right, so after Monet, we moved on to another artist. And his name was Henri Matisse. Good work. All right, and Henri Matisse used scissors, right? And he did a lot of cutout art. He was also famous for some paintings as well, and we did talk about that. So we talked about this one. It was called The Goldfish. And then we talked about this one. This one is called The Snail, right? So goofy. Does it look like a snail? Some of you decided yes, some of you decided no. We decided to spin it upside down, and then did that make it look more like a snail because we could see the curve then? Maybe, but art is whatever you want it to be, okay? We read 2 books that week. So if you were in my younger class, we read A Magical Day with Matisse, where we went through his works of art. And then if you were in my older classes, we went through Drawing with Scissors, which was written by Keisha Johnson. And she wrote all about Henri Matisse. And she's very young. She's like 7 when she wrote this book. So that was nice to read a story written by a kid for kids, right? We talked a lot about Henri's life and how that was in France. And then we talked about all of the cutout work that he did, like these, right? And then we talked about funky shapes. And so then we spent time cutting out funky shapes and gluing them on, right, to our pieces of paper. And for my youngest kids, we did the same thing, but we did it with tissue paper and we ripped it up and we put it on paper. So that was really cool. After those two, we moved on to Andy Warhol was his name. He's right here. Kind of had goofy hair. And he was famous for these Campbell soup cans, which I have a picture of right here. Right? That was one of his famous pieces. Here's another one. This is Marilyn Monroe. She was a famous actress, and we talked about that. So he did artwork with famous actresses. He did artwork for musicians. So he was really involved in pop culture, which is when you're involved in like actors and music and all that kind of stuff. When we did that, we read Andyland, if you were in my younger classes, where we showed some of his pieces of art. And if you were in my older classes, we read Uncle Andy's Cats. And that was about Uncle Andy and his mom getting a ton of cats. They had so many cats. It was crazy. And then at the end, they ended up having a little like adoption party for the cats. And Andy Warhol drew some art for the flyers. And then everybody wanted one of the cats, right? All right, after that, we moved on to Roy, super long last name, Lichtenstein. Roy Lichtenstein. And when we talked about Roy Lichtenstein, we talked about onomatopoeia, right? We talked about small words that sound like what they are. So knock and pop and splash. We talked about those kind of words. Here is one that says pop, right? And you can see all of the tiny little dot work in there. And then this is another one that Roy Lichtenstein is famous for, is this woman. She's very sad, she's crying. And then I thought this one was kind of fun because of who we talked about last week. Roy Lichtenstein did this Mickey picture, and it's Mickey and Donald fishing. And I thought that was really fun. When we talked about Roy Lichtenstein, we read Roy's House. And it was all about the house that Roy Lichtenstein lived in. And he did all of the artwork for this book. We talked about what they did if you came over to Roy's house. You had a soda and some pie, and it sounded super fun. After that, we moved on to Jean-Michel Basquiat, right? And he was famous for this crown that he put in a ton of his pictures. And here are some works of art by Jean-Michel. You can see this one is like, it's like a happy guy and he's got a crown on and it says smile down here, right? So that's kind of fun. And Jean-Michel used spray paint in his artwork. This is another one. It's like a dinosaur with a crown. That's pretty cool, right? I really like this one. This is very famous. And then we talked about there was a connection between Andy Warhol and Jean-Michel Basquiat. They knew each other and they did artwork together. And I found this picture of the two of them together at an art gallery in Brooklyn, I believe. They were doing an art show that evening together. And then we read Radiant Child, which was the book about Jean-Michel Basquiat, and it talked about his life and how when he was very young he decided he was going to be a famous artist, and he just kept working on that until it happened, which was really awesome, right? And you can do that too if you work really, really, really hard at it. And then after that we moved on to another artist. We moved on to Georgia O'Keeffe, right? And she was famous for her flower paintings. And so then we talked about some works of art. So we talked about this one, right? We talked about the shapes and how it kind of looks like movement. She had made this after listening to music. And so you can kind of see that movement of music in there. And then she also did a lot of scenes in the desert. Do you remember how we talked about how she painted in her car, which was so crazy? And so this is a desert one that she did. You can see the desert in the background, and then there's a skull because she would have found that. And then she always liked to bring something feminine to her paintings, so there is a flower in there. And when we did our study of Georgia O'Keeffe, we did read through Georgia's Eyes. And it talked about Georgia growing up and how she loved being outdoors. And so there's lots of pictures of her being outdoors, not only in the desert, but kind of everywhere. And so all of her paintings incorporated that nature into her works of art. And then, last but definitely not least, for sure a favorite, right? We talked about Walt Disney. And he is famous for creating, who's this guy? Mortimer Mouse, I think is his name. Is it Mortimer? No, it's Mickey. Mortimer was the name. It almost was, because that was what Walt Disney wanted to name his character. Here are some pieces of work from Walt Disney. So this is an old hand drawing he did of Mickey. And then we did watch a little movie. We watched a movie called Steamboat Willie, and Mickey was in that, and he was driving the boat, right? And then we read I Am Walt Disney, and this talked about him growing up in Marceline and how he really was just a fan of art and had started from a very young age, got in trouble for drawing on the side of a barn, and how he created Mickey and how his life went from there. Because we talked about that, we talked about animation. Do you remember there was a flip book and you could make your own flip book? And then I found this Gallup book, which I don't know that it's gonna pick up. Oh, there we go. It's picking up on the phone. So you see that? It's moving. So based on the way that you hold the page, it moves. This is called scanimation, when things work like that. So it's like animation, but it's just based on an optical illusion that you create. So we talked about that. All right, so those were all of our artists so far. And this next school year, we will get into many, many, many more. But I'm glad that we got to study all of these artists together. I'm glad you got to learn so many different styles of artwork. And we will incorporate some of those skills this summer. And if we don't see you, if you're moving on to an older grade, that's okay too, because you're gonna carry these skills with you through the rest of your life. And you'll work on art for many years to come. All right? Okay, everyone. I miss you if you're not here. I will see you soon, hopefully. Bye.